In a dense, moonlit forest, gnarled trees cast down eerie shadows on a headless hunter who gallops by with a phantom hound. And in a nearby cottage, a kobold spirit rattles dishes while unseen witches soar toward the broken mountain. This is German folklore, and that's just a hint, a glimpse into that rich tradition. It is indeed a sprawling realm of fairy tales, folk customs, supernatural beings and myths that have been developed over many centuries, one where history and imagination intertwine. An old peasant superstition might sit alongside a polished literary fairy tale, and pre-Christian gods live on, disguised as mountain specters or helpful house elves. We're going to talk about it all today. A bit of a longer video, but such is the nature of a topic that demands a good amount of time to be told. Allow me to welcome you to the channel. If you are new here, I invite you to hit the subscribe button. And why don't you leave a like and a comment? It helps push the video out a little bit more. Oh, and you can enjoy the video completely uninterrupted. There's no ads in any of the videos on this channel, and that's because we are sustained by the generous people on Patreon, YouTube memberships, the occasional donation through Super Thanks and PayPal, and of course, the merch store. All links can be found in the pinned comment, video description, and channel description, if you are interested in going and checking them out. Now, without further ado, let us continue our series, which can be found in the playlist, and today we talk about German folklore. So let's begin all the way back to those ancient mythological roots. Of course, long before Germany existed as our modern conception of a nation, we talk about it in a more regional sense, and the region was indeed inhabited by various Germanic tribes, whose beliefs and oral traditions laid the groundwork for much of what we now call folklore. The early Germanic mythos was a pagan one, sharing a common origin with the Nordic mythology. Gods such as Woden, more widely known as Odin, and Donar, Thor, were worshipped in sacred groves. Goddesses of earth and fertility were also revered at springs and forests. And this is where the Roman historian Tacitus comes in with his first-century work Germania, when he notes that the Germanic peoples had no temples of stone, but instead they consecrated groves and woodland sanctuaries, believing divinity was embedded in nature itself. This is a reverence for nature and the unseen spirits of the land, and it would persist in folklore belief long after Christianity had become dominant. But let's take it slow first. We are certainly starting well before Christian times, and those old times demand a bit more explanation. Let's first look at a striking example of ancient surviving folklore. That is the figure of Frau Hohl, or Mother Hohl. On the surface, Frau Hohl appears in later folk tales as a kindly old woman of the sky, who makes snow by shaking out her feather bed and rewards hard-working girls with gold. Yet, scholars have long noted that she strongly resembles an ancient mother goddess or spinning goddess from pre-Christian times. In fact, folk tradition casts Frau Hohl as a guardian of women's crafts like spinning flax, and is a spirit associated with winter's snows and the rejuvenation of spring. Similarly, there's another old female spirit. Bertha, or Perchta, was venerated in alpine regions. Now, Perchta was said to roam during the 12 nights of Christmas, inspecting spinning work, and whenever she found anyone being lazy, would dish out a punishment. In her dual nature, she could also appear either as a beautiful lady or a haggard crone. These figures likely echo a pre-Christian goddess of fate and fertility, preserved in disguise within Christian-era folklore. But they also demonstrate how pagan deities were not entirely forgotten, but they lived on in folk tales. Sometimes they were Christianized, sometimes even demonized, but ultimately they were still recognizable for those who knew where to look. Now, when Christianity spread through German lands, from the late Roman period into the early Middle Ages, it didn't just erase all of the old beliefs overnight. Instead, there was a long period of adaptation and syncretism. Church authorities often condemned folk practices that betrayed pagan origins. For instance, medieval clergy wrote penance manuals, scolding peasants for leaving milk out for house elves, or believing that certain women flew with the goddess Diana or Holder on night rides. While this later belief in nocturnal spirit rides would later feed into witch legends, but we'll get to that a bit later. But despite clerical disapproval, the common people held on to many customs. They had sacred trees, harvest rituals, holy wells, and charms for healing or fertility. They all continued, but under a very thin Christian veneer, just enough to get away with it, it seems. Some pagan festivals were rebranded with Christian meanings. A famous example is how the old midwinter Yule celebrations eventually became associated with Christmas. Or how, for example, spring fertility rites folded into Easter traditions. In fact, even the name Easter, from the German Ostern, might derive from Ostera, a putative dawn goddess of spring, though known mainly through the speculations of Jacob Grimm rather than concrete early records. But whether or not Ostera was truly worshipped, the fact remains that seasonal customs in Germany retained a strong folkloric character reflecting cycles of nature and, of course, agrarian life, a lot more strictly than their scriptural origins would. And then there's the cosmic battle of pagan and Christian worldviews. That is something that is widely recorded in German folklore, but quite quietly at some points. One vivid motive is the wild hunt, the Wilderjagd, a ghostly procession of spirits or demons sweeping across the sky on stormy nights. In German stories, the wild hunt is sometimes led by the old god Wodan himself, thundering through the clouds with his spectral hounds, chasing souls, or even the unhallowed dead. Other times, the leader is a cursed mortal hunter, such as the legendary Count Hackelberg, doomed to hunt forever for his sins, or even Frau Hol or Perchta in some regions, transformed into a nocturnal hunt mistress. In any case, and variations aside, peasants from centuries told tales of hearing the hounds of the wild hunt raging above the treetops. Anyone who encountered it might be swept away or struck down, so folk wisdom advised people to take cover indoors during wild weather and to avoid whistling, lest it attract those ghostly riders. Of course, the church raised an eyebrow to this kind of thing, and they tried to recast such phenomena as demonic illusions, or even the work of the devil himself. But the imagery of the wild hunt was so deeply rooted in the collective imagination that it persisted in legend. It illustrates how pre-Christian traditions, that furious host of Wodan, was not forgotten but kept alive as folklore, albeit now tinged with fear and infernal awe under Christian interpretation. And here's another relic of Germanic myth and folklore. That's the storytelling of heroic legends. Long ago, Germanic bards sang of heroes and gods. Poems like the Hildebrandsled and the oral lays that later inspired the great medieval epics. The medieval poem, the Song of the Nibelungs, composed around the 13th century, crystallized some of the older heroic legends into a more national epic in print. But it recounts the exploits of one Siegfried, a dragon slayer who bathes in the dragon's blood to become invulnerable, save for one spot on his back, by the way, and the tragic tale of his wife Kriemhild and the Burgundian knights. Though written by an unknown court poet, the Song of the Nibelungs drew on much older traditions, and that includes elements of mythology and possibly echoes of historical events from the time of migrating tribes. Everything comes from somewhere, after all. In any case, the endurance of the Nibelungen saga in popular imagination, later revived by Richard Wagner's operas in the 19th century, certainly shows how myth can merge with folklore. Characters like Siegfried, the treasure of the Nibelungs, and the dragon he slew became staples in German folklore and art, representing the valor but also the tragedy of the old times. Of course, German folklore continued to evolve through a medieval and early modern lens, and during these times it gathered an enormous trove of legends and heroic figures. Of course, it only enriches the entire landscape of it. These legends often blur the line between myth and history, of course, and they provide people with moral lessons, entertainment, and a sense of shared heritage, long before the existence of mass media. So let's meet a few of them. First of all, let's look at the sleeping emperor, Barbarossa. It is a widespread German legend that speaks of an emperor who never truly died, but sleeps away in a hidden mountain, awaiting the hour of his country's greatest need. The emperor is usually identified as Frederick Barbarossa, a red-bearded 12th century king. According to the law, Barbarossa rests in a deep cavern in central Germany, in a place called the Kyffhauser Mountain. He sits at a stone table, so that his fiery red beard has grown through the table's surface. Ravens circle the mountain peaks. As long as they fly, the tale goes, Barbarossa must slumber. But one day, when the ravens cease to fly and Germany is in its direst peril, the emperor will awaken, and his knights will restore purity to the realm. Such a legend shows how folklore can turn historical figures into mythic saviors. In times of turmoil, the Kyffhauser legend gained popularity after Barbarossa's line died out, and again in the 19th century, amid nationalist hopes. People found comfort in the notion of a dormant hero who embodied the spirit of Germany. The Barbarossa myth also shows parallels to King Arthur legends in Britain, a once and future king motif, showing how common human longings for deliverance manifest in different cultures' folklore. Well, then we have Faust, the man who sold his soul. Few German legends have made such literary and cultural impact as Dr. Faust. The legend is rooted in a historical person too, Johann Georg Faust, a wandering scholar, alchemist, and magician who lived in the 16th century. He gained notoriety for allegedly practicing sorcery and necromancy, and after his death, various fantastical tales sprang up about him. The central legend is that Faust, in his insatiable quest for knowledge and pleasure, made a pact with the devil, trading his soul in exchange for demonic service for a number of years. With the devil, often named Mephistopheles, as his servant, Faust purportedly indulged in all manner of marvels and misdeeds, from the summoning of the spirit of Helen of Troy to drunkenly flying on a barrel. But in the end, when his time was up, the devil carried Faust off to hell as his payment. It is a cautionary tale of hubris and damnation, first popularized in an 1857 chapbook, that is a cheap printed folk book, that circulated widely in Germany. It became so famous that the name Faust is now synonymous with a Faustian bargain, sacrificing moral integrity for power or knowledge. Importantly, German folklore's Faust legend was later transformed into great literature by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, whose poetic drama, Faust Part 1, published in 1808, humanized the character and added these complex philosophical dimensions to him. Goethe even incorporated folkloric elements like the Walpurgis night witch revel, more on that soon, into the masterpiece. Well, thus, Faust legend shows how a folk tale can evolve from a fireside legend to a printed book, and then to a refined literary work, all while retaining its core as a tale that resonated with the German people, who understood the temptations of forbidden knowledge. But there is perhaps the most haunting of Germany's legends. That is the story of the Rattenfänger von Hamelin, that is the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Set in the town of Hameln in Lower Saxony, the legend describes a mysterious piper, dressed in multicolored, pied clothing, who appeared in the year 1284. The town, according to later versions of the tale, was suffering from a terrible infestation of rats, and the piper offered to rid them of the plague for a sum of money. He played his flute and lured the rats into the river Weser to drown. Yet when the townsfolk refused to pay him the promised reward, the piper took a bitter revenge. On June 26, 1284, while the adults were in church, he played a different melody and lured away the town's children, leading 130 boys and girls out of the town and into a mountain, where they vanished forever. This macabre story is not mere fancy. It is attested by medieval references. An inscription in Hamelin and references in manuscripts note that around 130 children were lost in 1284 under puzzling circumstances. But interestingly, early accounts do not mention rats at all. The rat plague detail was added to the folklore in later centuries, perhaps to give the piper a bit of a motive, and of course to give the story a bit of a moral element. The Pied Piper legend has invited countless interpretations. Was it a metaphor for the plague, the children dying or leaving in a migration? Was the piper a personification of death, or even of a pagan god leading the children to the other world? Well, whatever its origin, the tale became a classic German folk tale, retold by the Brothers Grimm among others, and it serves as a lasting cautionary legend about the consequences of not fulfilling your end of the bargain. A deal is a deal. And to this day, Hamelin embraces the legend within its identity, with names like street names like Bungelonsenstrasse, the street without drums, said to mark where the music is forbidden since the children's disappearance. In any case, the piper's eerie call still echoes as one of folklore's most compelling mysteries. Well, next we have Till Eulenspiegel, the trickster peasant. And not all folk legends are tragic or solemn. Some, like this one, are filled with earthy humor and social satire, embodied, of course, in trickster figures. And Germany's most famous folkloric trickster is Till Eulenspiegel, a character whose exploits were first published in 1510, but were part of a long oral tradition. Now, Eulenspiegel, whose name in Low German literally means owl mirror, symbolically an owl mirror reflecting foolishness, is portrayed as a wandering jester or rogue in the 14th century, who plays pranks on the proud and gullible. The cycle of tales about him shows him traveling from town to town across Germany and beyond, cleverly exposing human vices, greed, vanity, hypocrisy, by taking people's words quite literally. For example, in one story, a baker angrily tells Eulenspiegel to stop loafing around and literally bake owls and monkeys, an idiom for wasting time in German, by the way. I know, I don't make the rules. In any case, the mischievous Till proceeds to do exactly that. He shapes dough into owl and monkey forms and then bakes them. Well, the baker's not very impressed by it, I'm afraid. In another tale, he hangs out a shingle as a doctor, promising to teach people to squeeze blood from a stone when a patient seeks this miracle. Till simply drops a stone on the man's foot until it bleeds, thus technically fulfilling the claim. For these absurd antics entertained common folk, but also subtly mocked authority figures, clergy, nobility, and town burghers, who often end up looking foolish in Eulenspiegel's tricks. As a folklore character, Till Eulenspiegel embodies the everyman's wit and irreverence, akin to tricksters in many cultures, like foxes in fables or Anansi the spider in African lore. And yes, we'll get to African lore later on. He is said to be buried in the town of Moln, where a tombstone with an owl and mirror is a tourist attraction. Through centuries, Eulenspiegel's name became proverbial in German for someone sly and humorous, showing once again how a folkloric character can become ingrained in the language and, of course, popular conscience. But then we have Lorelei, the siren of the Rhine. High above the Rhine River, on a steep slate rock cliff near St. Gorshausen, there is a legendary spot called the Lorelei. According to German legend, this rock is haunted by a siren maiden whose enchanting song lures boatmen to their doom on the treacherous river rocks below. The story goes like this. Lorelei was once a mortal woman, usually said to be a beautiful maiden betrayed by a faithless lover. In despair, she threw herself into the Rhine and was transformed into a kind of water spirit. Thereafter, she would sit atop the cliff, combing her golden hair and singing with a voice so alluring that sailors passing by would be mesmerized, forget to steer, and then wreck their ships on the reef. It's a romantic yet deadly image. Lorelei's captured imagination since the 19th century. And interestingly, the Lorelei tale is the product of a romantic literature that became folklore. You see, the German writer Clemens Brentano first introduced a poem about a siren named Lorelei in 1801, and the poet Heinrich Heine's famous 1824 poem De Lorelei sealed her fame. Local folks began to treat the literary creation as if it were an old legend of the Rhine. After all, the echo of the real Lorelei rock could inspire thoughts of a singing spirit. In this way, the Lorelei demonstrates how literature and folklore intertwine. A newly invented story can be so evocative that it enters the popular tradition, as though it had always been there. And today any river cruise down the Rhine will likely include the tale of the Lorelei, and her mythic figure stands as an iconic example of German Rhine romanticism and legendary lore. Of course, when I hear the word Lorelei, I think of the old song by Theatre of Tragedy with Lorelei as well, which kind of tells the story, but yeah, I don't know. It's a bit of an older band. Maybe I'm showing my age a bit. In any case, these examples are just a little sampling. German folklore boasts countless other legendary figures. Knightly figures like Roland, whose statue stands in Bremen as a symbol of civic liberty based on the hero from medieval chansons, and charismatic outlaws like the robber baron Schinderhannes, who became folk anti-heroes. And then we have saints and Christian legends such as St. Boniface felling the Donar oak, or the compassionate St. Martin sharing his cloak celebrated in the lantern-lit Martinstag each November. But of course, there's darker legends, like the many German werewolf tales that surface in times of chaos. The word werewolf itself is German for man-wolf, and in the 16th and 17th centuries, German regions experienced their share of werewolf paranoia, alongside the witch trials. Maybe I'll do a full video about werewolves. I've done once about vampire history. I know vampire history, but if you watch the video, you'll know what I mean. It's more about the concept and the hysteria surrounding those creatures. In any case, all of this just contributes to a quite interesting oral narrative. They serve to teach values, explain the unexplainable, or just entertain. Of course, it's all in good fun at the end. Of course, let's look at the forests, mountains, and even the nights of Germany, because they have long been believed to hide all manner of otherworldly entities, as through these creatures that we glimpse the fears, hopes, and ultimately the creative imagination of the people who told stories about them. Some of them are frightening, some are mischievous, some are even helpful, but they're all fascinating. So first, let's have a look at the Heinzelmanken and kobolds, that is the household spirits. German homes were traditionally thought to host invisible house spirits that could be beneficial if treated well, or of course troublesome if offended. The city of Cologne, for example, has the famous legend of the Heinzelmanken, tiny house-dwelling gnomes or elves. According to the tale, these little folk would come at night and help people out with their work, baking bread, stitching clothes, doing chores in secret, so that by morning the human homeowners found that their tasks were all miraculously finished. Now the Heinzelmanken asked for no payment other than the occasional bowl of milk or food left out. However, as the legend goes, one curious woman scattered peas on the floor to trip the helpers or spy on them. Offended at this breach of trust, the Heinzelmanken vanished forever from Cologne, never to return. Well, this story not only entertains, but also imparts a gentle moral about gratitude and the perils of human curiosity spoiling a good thing. Someone always ruins it, don't they? Well, the broader category for such beings is the kobold, as a word that in German folklore refers to a mischievous household spirit in particular. A kobold might do chores or bring luck, but if insulted, say by not being given share of supper or by hearing complaints, it would turn into a poltergeist, hiding tools, breaking dishes, this kind of thing. So many German families kept little rituals to stay on a kobold's good side, like offering a bit of beer or bread in the attic. The very idea of a poltergeist, German for noisy ghost, by the way, that throws things around in a house likely stems from these old kobold tales. Such beliefs reveal how pre-scientific societies tried to explain the odd household happening, a missing sock or a creaky floorboard, all attributed to some capricious, invisible friend, or perhaps foe. Well, given Germany's abundance of deep forests and rugged mountains, it's no surprise that folklore places many magical races in the wilderness. Dwarves, or Zwerg in German, are among the most commonly mentioned. A small, bearded folk, living among hills or in mines, often guarding treasures or practicing metallurgy, and quite good at it as well. Long before Walt Disney's cheerful Seven Dwarves, Germany had its own version, and their mythology and folklore depicted dwarves as skilled blacksmiths and miners, and indeed in the Nibelungen legend, the treasure of the Nibelungs is guarded by the dwarf Ulbrich. Dwarves in folk tales can sometimes help humans out too, forging a splendid sword or revealing a load of ore. But they demand respect, and above all, secrecy. Don't go running your mouth off, While many legends warn against stealing from the dwarves or trying to outsmart them, as they can curse the thief with misfortune. Alongside dwarves are the so-called Waldgeister, or forest spirits, and one notable figure is the Wildermann, or the wild man, a mythical hairy giant said to lurk in forests clad in leaves or moss. Wild men, also called woodwosers, appear in medieval lore as symbols of untamed nature. In some legends, they are benighted humans living like beasts. In others, they're kind of more like magical guardians of the woods. In the folklore of the Alps, related to the wild man are the moss people, the moss Viblen or the moss manlin, small moss-clad forest dwarves that can be benign if respected. And there's a charming tale from Thuringia, which tells of a moss woman who taught a farmer the art of making white beer, on the condition that he not reveal her secret. Well, guess what? He broke the promise, and the forest folk abducted him. We don't really know what happened to that poor soul. Well, through such stories, we see the theme of reciprocity with nature's spirits. Humans can benefit from woodland elves and wild folk, but only if they honor their word and the sanctity of the forest. And beware the giant of the mountains, for instance, Rubizal, the giant trickster spirit of the giant mountains, the Reisengebirge in Silesia. The Rubizal would sometimes appear as a monstrous giant or a humble mountaineer. He was known to play pranks on travelers or punish the arrogant, yet he might also guide lost wanderers to safety. His name actually means turnip counter, comes from one humorous tale where a would-be suitor mockingly asked this spirit to count turnips in a field, hoping to be rid of him, only for Rubizal to retaliate by sending a storm or kidnapping the man's bride. Rubizal became a beloved folklore figure, appearing in countless Silesian and Bohemian legends, and later in literary folk tales. Now, just quickly, a little joke just came into my head. Did you hear about the vegetable wedding? Apparently, there was a huge turn-up. Right. Well, through Rubizal and others, the mountains and forests gained kind of personalities of their own in German storytelling, at once awe-inspiring, dangerous, and sometimes generous to those who showed humility. But of course, best be on your good behavior. The spirits do not take kindly to being used up. Well, away from the forests, we have the rivers and the lakes, and those in Germany are similarly enlivened by folklore. We have nixies, or nixen, water spirits akin to mermaids or water nymphs, and in German tales, a nixie is often a beautiful female figure seen in rivers or ponds, sometimes benign but quite often dangerous. A famous legend tells of the Rhine maidens, 3 water nymphs who guard a treasure of gold in the Rhine River, an element Wagner wove into his opera, by the way. These maidens enchanting songs could beguile sailors. Likewise, various lakes have their legends of nixies who drag down those who swim alone at dusk, or who yearn for human lovers with tragic results. Perhaps the most iconic water spirit story is that of Lorelei that we discussed earlier, essentially a nixie on a rock. But there are also male water spirits, like the Nickelmann or the Wassergeist, who might appear as an old man in wet clothes to warn of floods, or the Klabautermann, who lives on ships, technically a kobold of the naval kind, I suppose. Shifting from spirits to shapeshifters, German folklore is replete with tales of werewolves and other were-creatures, and the concept of a werewolf, a human cursed or charmed into turning into a wolf at the full moon, was not only a horror story, but, in dark times, a very real fear. Of course, Some accused werewolves were even tried across from witches in the 17th century. I suppose wait for the full moon, and if they don't turn into a werewolf, well, that's the best evidence you can get. At least it's an easy crime to prove wrong. Folktales speak of men who made pacts or put on a magic belt to become a wolf and attack their enemies or livestock, only to be eventually caught when the spell wore off. In the region of the Harz Mountains, a creature called the bear wolf was spoken of. Not literally a bear wolf, but, despite the name's look, rather a term for a malevolent werewolf-like being, or sometimes a metaphorically name for a violent criminal, something like this. After all, a bear and a wolf put together, well, they're two very malevolent forces in nature. Now, these tales served as both chilling entertainment, but also cautionary tales about beasts within humans. They also tie into the reality that wolf attacks were a genuine concern in earlier centuries, thus generating lore to rationalize why someone might turn savage. In contrast, some shape-shifting stories have a lighter touch. For instance, the Wolpertinger of Bavarian folklore, a whimsical mismatched creature said to inhabit alpine forests, with the body of a hare, antlers of a deer, wings of a bird, and fangs. Now, clearly a tall tale, and a source of amusing fake taxidermy sold to gullible visitors too, by the way. The Wolpertinger represents the playful side of folklore, where people enjoy spinning fantastical yarns for just a bit of fun, because why not? Well, then we have the more, I suppose, the scarier side of things. Witches, nightmares, the demonic. Beliefs about malevolent forces reached a peak in the witchcraft lore of the late medieval and early modern period. Witches in German folklore were typically imagined as women, and sometimes men. They called warlocks Hexenmeister, who made a pact with the devil and gained magical powers to harm neighbors or livestock. Folklore held that witches could fly on broomsticks or even pitchforks, brew foul potions, blight crops, cause storms, and shapeshift into animals like cats or wolves. A unique element of German witch lore is the Walpurgisnacht, or the Witch's Night. It was believed that on the night of April 30th, that is May Eve, all the witches of Germany would gather together for a Sabbat on the Brocken, the highest peak of the Harz Mountains. This belief is vividly depicted in Goethe's Faust, where Mephistopheles takes Faust to the witches in the wild revelry, dancing with the devil on the Brocken on Walpurgis night. The very name, Walpurgisnacht, blends pagan and Christian. Saint Walpurga was an 8th century English missionary whose feast day coincides with the 1st of May. But in folklore, her eve became associated with the ancient spring festival of Beltane, when the veil between worlds thinned and witches supposedly rode out among the living. To protect themselves on this fearsome night, villagers would light bonfires, and they would accompany this with the very noisy fireworks too. They would also hang sprigs of blessed herbs on doorways and hide their brooms so witches couldn't steal them for riding. Even as the witch trial hysteria of the 15th and 17th centuries subsided, the idea of Walpurgisnacht persisted in popular imagination and has in modern times become quite a fun folkloric celebration in part of Germany, where people dressing as witches and dancing into the May. Well, along with witch lore, German folklore has given us the very concept of the nightmare, a word which in English comes from the German Nachtmar. Now, the Nachtmar, or Alp, was thought to be an evil spirit, sometimes a witch's soul traveling by night, that sits on a sleeper's chest, causing distressing dreams and a feeling of suffocation. Many a German farmer placed a carved horse head or a broom under the bed as a charm to keep the Alp at bay, and some recited rhymes to prevent the witch from riding them in their sleep. Their words, not mine. That's, well, how they put it. Well, these beliefs surrounding sleep paralysis and bad dreams highlight how folklore tried to personify and thus control human fears, giving a name and shape to the unknown forces that cause nightmares. Now, similarly, the folklore of the doppelganger, that is the double goer, arises from psychological fear. It is the idea that every person has a spectral double, and seeing that exact duplicate of oneself is an omen of death. This concept became a motive in German Romantic literature, but it began as an eerie folklore notion that perhaps stemmed from the real anecdotes, people claiming to have seen someone who looked exactly like them or mistaking a stranger for a familiar person who was actually elsewhere. Of course, the term doppelganger has entered the English lexicon from German, testament perhaps to how compelling the idea is, but it's not so grim in our vernacular, I suppose. In essence, whether through witches causing milk to spoil or shapeless things to go bump in the night, German folklore certainly got a rich catalogue of supernatural ways to explain misfortune, enforce moral norms, and also entertain with a good bit of scaring behind it. Next, we have ghosts, and just in general, cursed souls. Plenty of them, too, to keep you up at night in German contexts. It's as diverse as its regions are. Many castles and old mansions are said to be haunted by the Weberfrau, the White Lady, a female ghost often thought to be the spirit of a wronged noblewoman, or a grief-stricken mother. For example, Hohenzollern royal family's folklore included a white lady ghost who would appear, dressed in a white gown. Whenever a death in the family was impending, she would show up. Not the kind of person you want to see. So she was believed to be a revenant of a medieval countess who committed some kind of sin. Versions vary, but often involving infanticide or a tragic loss, and thus she was doomed to wander as a spectre. German folklore also speaks of the headless rider, a decapitated ghost on horseback, sometimes identified as a victim of war or as a relentless hunter who injured the forest sprites, but also of vengeful ghosts that seek redress for past wrongs. The concept of the Nachzehrer, a type of undead in northern German lore, is particularly gruesome. Essentially an idea of a proto-vampire, where a dead person, often a victim of the plague, or perhaps they took their own lives, does not rest peacefully, but chews on their burial shroud or their own flesh, causing a wasting illness to their surviving family. To prevent such undead, people in some regions would place a stone or a coin in the corpse's mouth, or drive a stake through the corpse, practices akin to vampire lore in Eastern Europe. While not as globally famous as Transylvanian vampires, these German folkloric measures show a common human concern with ensuring that the dead stay that way. But on a kinder note, some ghost stories were almost moral in tone, like the tale of the Klagemumme, a banshee-like wailing aunt figure whose mournful cries warned of an upcoming death, but also indicated the soul's longing for prayer. Once the proper prayers or masses were said, the Klagemumme's cries would cease, implying the wandering soul finally found peace. In rural communities, sharing ghost stories by the hearth was a way to affirm beliefs about the afterlife, justice, and of course the proper rituals for the dead. But it also certainly gave listeners a thrill, perhaps made him think twice about walking alone near the village graveyard after dark. One can only imagine. Okay, well, moving on from all of that, leaving all the ghosts and werewolves behind us, I suppose we can't talk about the German folklore traditions without talking about the Brothers Grimm. Of course, when you think of German folklore, it's often fairy tales that most readily spring to mind, and those enchanting and sometimes dark stories of morality, magic, and everything in between have been told and retold around the world. In fact, Germany's contribution to the fairy tale canon is monumental, largely in fact to efforts by collectors like the Brothers Grimm. So let's explore the German fairy tale tradition under that lens, shall we? So long before any fairy tales were written down, like most countries in the world, they survived in oral tradition, told by grandmothers and grandchildren, grandmothers to grandchildren, rather, spinners at the spinning wheel or travellers resting at the inn, this kind of thing. In German lands, as elsewhere in Europe, countless generations passed on stories that served to entertain on those dark nights, but also to impart lessons. Now these oral tales, called Märchen in German, roughly meaning little stories, often featured timeless settings. It would start off something like, there once was a poor baker, or once upon a time in a faraway land, that kind of thing. That kind of familiarity kind of replaced that concrete historical context, and it kind of set the tone of what you were in for. But it also allowed stories to travel and transform, easily adaptable to any local era. Yet, keen listeners can detect reflections of the historical reality of the common folk in these tales. Themes of famine, hard labor, social injustice, they crop up frequently, just dressed up in a fantasy setting. For example, the well-known story of Hansel and Gretel. It tells of children abandoned in the woods due to their parents' extreme poverty during a famine. Now, a scenario not completely unimaginable in medieval or early modern times of scarcity. It happened, unfortunately, a bit more than you would think. But in this story, the grim situation gives way to the fantastical gingerbread house and the witch. But at its heart is the memory of a real hardship and the instinct of children to survive. Similarly, Cinderella, or Aschenputtel in German variants, endures cruel treatment by a stepmother, reflecting the not uncommon plight of orphans or stepchildren in traditional societies who might be disfavored in a household. Fairy tales provided a kind of imaginative escape and resolution to these difficulties. In the tales, virtue is rewarded, evil is punished. Cinderella goes from the cinders to marrying a prince, while her wicked stepsisters in the Grimm version receive a rather violent comeuppance. In fact, if you don't know, actually doves fly in and peck their eyes out during the wedding. Yeah, not all fairy tales are for children, I suppose. In any case, orally transmitted fairy tales carry the values and hopes of ordinary people. That kindness, cleverness, courage might triumph over cruelty and misfortune, overcome the odds. And, well, the genius of these stories is that they convey messages in a symbolic and memorable way. And many of them, of course, we have because of the Brothers Grimm. So by the early 19th century, oral tales were in danger of being forgotten or changed beyond recognition as Europe rapidly modernized. And so enter Jacob and Wilhelm. Jacob, born in 1785. Wilhelm, a year later. Two scholars from Hessen, who had a passion for German language and tradition. Initially trained in law and linguistics, the Brothers Grimm became inspired by the romantic nationalist idea that the true soul of a people, the Volksseele, resides in its folk culture. The song, tales, and language, untouched by sophisticated courtly influence. So, in 1806, Germany was a patchwork of small states. and the Napoleonic occupation was well and truly underway. A sense of national and cultural identity was growing as individuals and intellectuals sought something distinctly German in its flavor. Well, the Grimms believed that collecting the Märchen of the common folk would both preserve precious cultural heritage and perhaps even define a German identity that transcended the many tiny principalities. They began gathering tales, not by wandering the countryside incognito, as is sometimes romantically imagined, but largely by interviewing friends, relatives, and local peasants or middle-class storytellers who knew the old tales. One of their noted sources was a woman named Dorothea Wehmann, the daughter of an innkeeper who had a prodigious memory for stories. Many of Hesse's oral tales were recorded from her dictation. In 1812, Jacob and Wilhelm published the first volume of Kinder- und Hausmärchen, Children's and Household Tales, containing 86 stories, and a second volume in 1815 brought the total to 170. These books are now famously known as Grimm's fairy tales, and you might be surprised that they were not immediate bestsellers, but over subsequent editions, they issued many revisions up through 1857, they began to grow in popularity, especially as the brothers edited the content and style to be a little more appealing to families. So it is worth noting that the Grimms approached their work as folklorists and language scholars, not as mere entertainers. It was a bit more academic in its nature, and they didn't really see it as strictly children's books either. It was more a cultural preservation project. Jacob Grimm's prefacers proclaimed the authenticity of the old Germanic nature of these tales. He and Wilhelm at first preserved archaic turns of phrase and rustic frankness. For instance, early versions of their tales could be quite blunt or gruesome. One infamous story they included in the first edition was quote, how some children played at slaughtering, a tale where young kids reenact a pig slaughter and accidentally kill each other instead. Well, needless to say, that one was dropped in the later editions. It was not as popular with the public. Well, anyway, as the Kinder- und Hausmärchen underwent revisions, Wilhelm especially polished the narratives, adding literary flourishes or Christian moral touches, sometimes even toning down a few of these sexual elements, while actually heightening some of the violent retribution against villains. The result, by the final 1857 edition, was a collection of tales that still felt authentically folk-like, but were a lot smoother to read, and more clearly moral. Some critics then and now have pointed out that the Grimms were not just passive collectors, but rather editors and shapers of the folklore to fit a vision, one that emphasized piety, work ethic, and family values consistent in the 19th century bourgeois norms. For example, in early oral visions, the villain in Hansel and Gretel was likely the biological mother, desperate due to hunger. The Grimms made her a stepmother, perhaps to soften the horror of a real mother betraying her own children, and to adhere to the image of an ideal loving mother. Likewise, the Grimms added the image of Little Red Riding Hood being rescued by a huntsman who cuts the wolf open, a scene that is not found in Charles Perrault's classic French version, which ended a little bit more grimly, I suppose we can say. Well, this gave a more redemptive, less cynical ending, and introduced a heroic masculine figure to save the day. These editorial choices indicate how the Grimm's fairy tales were filtered through their own era's lens. Yet, despite modifications, the core of the tales remained the voices of the Volk, the people. The Grimms succeeded in their mission. they salvaged dozens upon dozens of tales, which might have otherwise faded away, and in doing so, they created a treasury that has since been translated into 160 languages. And, well, up to the point of this video, it has never gone out of print. Well, let's look at a few notable German fairy tales and their themes. First of all, we have Snow White, which is Schneewittchen, a tale of a princess with skin as white as snow, hair as black as ebony, lips as red as blood, whose jealous stepmother, there's that stepmother motive again, tries to repeatedly murder her. The 7 dwarves, with whom Snow White finds refuge, reflect the traditional mining culture of Germany. In fact, some scholars think the tale might have been inspired by memories of miners, as children in some regions did work the mines in past centuries. The villainess's queen's use of a poison apple and her magic mirror have become quite iconic. Ultimately, her punishment in the Grimm's version, being forced to dance in red-hot iron shoes until she dies, illustrates a harsh poetic justice common in older fairy tales. You won't find that in the Disney version, won't you? In any case, Snow White's death-like sleep and revival by a prince, it might symbolize a kind of rebirth or even reference old folk beliefs of magic causing trances. The story also may encode a warning about vanity and envy, given the fate of the queen, who could not tolerate someone else's beauty. Well, then we have, of course, Hansel and Gretel. Very typical German tale. It's rich in its symbolism, too. The breadcrumb trail eaten by birds shows the theme of being lost in the woods, and historically that's a very real fear, since forests were indeed dangerous frontiers. The witch's gingerbread house, well, that presents a fascinating duality. It's a child dream, that being unlimited sweets, but also a trap for cannibalistic intent at the same time. And that dual nature, enticing yet deadly, I suppose we could read it as a metaphor for temptation itself. Interestingly, the witch in Grimm's telling has poor eyesight but a keen sense of smell. She chants, "Nibble, nibble, little mouse who is nibbling at my house." Ugh. Well, Hansel tricks her by offering her a bone through a cage to feel instead of his finger to delay his fate, showing that cleverness can outwit brute evil. Gretel's climactic act of shoving the witch into the oven is a cathartic reversal of victim and oppressor. The children's eventual return home with jewels taken from the witch's house transforms their initial poverty into prosperity, a common fairy tale ending, promising that suffering can be overcome. Well, then we have Rumpelstiltskin, which is pronounced pretty much the same in German. It's a distinctly German-flavored tale about the peril of making promises under duress. You see, a miller's daughter is forced by a king to spin straw into gold. That's an impossible task, as we all know, unless there's somebody out there who can do it. Well, a dwarf-like imp appears to perform the magic in exchange for all of her possessions, culminating in a demand of her first-born child. Of course, when the child is born, the only way to break the contract is for the now queen to guess the name of the imp. When she discovers, through pure luck, the imp dances around a fire in the woods singing his own name, "Rumpelstiltskin, no one knows my little name." The drama here revolves around the power of names, of course, a theme in many cultures, indicating that knowing a being's true name gives you power over it. Well, the name Rumpelstiltskin in German literally refers to a little rattle-stilt-or goblin, an archaic term. Knowing the character is a folkloric sprite personifying perhaps the chaos of unkept promises. But this tale might also be interpreted as a commentary on greed and pride. The miller's foolish boast that his daughter can do impossible things sets the entire trouble into motion. The king's greed for gold drives his cruelty, and the strange helper's pride in his name leads to his downfall. Well, a little more of a light-hearted one. The Bremen town musicians, of 4 aging animals, a donkey, a dog, a cat, and a rooster, who, mistreated or neglected by their masters, run away to become musicians in Bremen. Along their journey, they scare off a band of robbers from a cottage by standing on each other's backs and cacophonously shouting and making noise. The robbers think that a terrible monster is attacking. Though they never actually reach Bremen, the animals do live happily at the robber's cottage. This tale is essentially about finding a new purpose later in life. The animals were old and considered useless, but together they found strength. And about the value of cooperation, too. The animals' comic teamwork and the triumph of underdogs, over the human criminals. Well, that made it a beloved and remembered tale. Now, as for the city of Bremen, they also embrace the story that a statue of the 4-tiered animal stands there to this very day. It's interesting that the tale has no magical elements either. Well, if you don't cast talking animals as magical. Well, in fable tradition at least, that is more of a representation of ordinary folks. And not every beloved folktale in Germany was about a princess or a witch, and not all of it ended in violence either. This one's more about friendship and optimism. But then, of course, we have Rotkapken, that is Little Red Riding Hood. Everyone knows that one for sure. Now, the version told in Germany, has a happier ending than its French predecessor. Well, in the Grimm tale, a hunter cuts open the wolf to save Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother, and later sows the wolf's belly with stones as punishment, causing him to collapse. Another instance of harsh justice. Little Red's story is often discussed for its symbolism of growing up and also a little bit of sexual danger, that being the big bad wolf being the predatory male figure, and Little Red Riding Hood possibly signifying the maturation. Well, folklorists do debate those interpretations, but certainly straightforward and moral given by Perrault, that is, children, especially pretty girls, should never talk to strangers, would have been well appreciated in folk culture, where such admonitions could certainly save lives. Now, the German name Rotkapchen, Little Red Cap, indicates she wore a cap rather than a hood in the original telling, indicating perhaps an older rural fashion. Well, the tale's enduring popularity has made the figure of the big bad wolf a quintessential villain, and this is notable in Germany, considering that actual wolves had largely been exterminated there by the 19th century. The folk memory of the wolf as a menace survived in stories long after the real animal vanished. Only in recent decades have wolves begun to return to German forests. So, well, be careful on your hikes, I suppose. Well, beyond all of these, the Brothers Grimm preserved a myriad of other tales. Rapunzel with her long hair, the Frog King. Well, actually the one with the Frog King, where a princess disgusts turns to love, famously ending with a transformation either by a kiss, in the original Grimm version, by the princess throwing the frog against a wall in frustration, which is a little bit more straightforward way of dealing with it. Also, there's the Elves and the Shoemaker, Mother Hole, which we discussed, and then we have the Goose Girl, the Six Swans, Fisherman and his wife, all that sort of thing. Through all these stories, certain themes shine quite brightly. The virtue of hard work, humility, kindness, the vice of pride, greed, and envy, it's all there. But there is also an underlying faith that even the lowliest, a mistreated child, an old donkey, poor miller's son, can rise to happiness, with a bit of luck and a bit of magical assistance from time to time. Of course, the publication of Grimm's fairy tales had a pretty big influence not only within Germany, but eventually internationally. The stories inspired poets, playwrights, and composers, from German romantic artists to later global creators of children's books and movies. But they also founded the academic field of folklore studies, that is, Volkskunde, as the Grimm's methodology and the Arne Thompson tale type index that later grew from such collections allowed scholars to compare variants of tales across cultures. Yet, it is important to apply a bit of critical thinking to fairy tales as cultural artifacts. For one, the Grimm collection gave the impression of a unified German folklore. But in reality, many of these tales were transnational. The Grimms included variants of stories that also existed in France, Italy, or elsewhere. For example, Briar Rose, Sleeping Beauty, had a known literary source in Perrault's French tales, and also Little Red Riding Hood, and otherwise. The brothers were sometimes consciously assembling a tapestry of European folklore, but just through a German lens. In any case, they corresponded with and were aware of other folklorists. Thus, while we celebrate Grimm's tales as German folklore, it's not the be-all and end-all. We also acknowledge that folklore ignores political borders. It travels with migrants, soldiers, marriages, meaning many German tales are quite international, at least in the European sense, but who knows really how far it all goes back. And here's another consideration. That is how the values in fairy tales align or conflict with modern sensibilities. Over time, editors and educators sanitized some of the content. The Grimms themselves started that by editing some violent or risque bits in the 20th century. English translations often further softened the cruelty too. While 20th century adaptations, notably Disney films, altered plots quite a bit to significantly fit contemporary tastes and moral messages. And this reflects changing attitudes. For instance, modern retellings might try to remove the passive damsel in distress trope, giving agency to heroines who were originally quite helpless. One can compare the Grimm's Snow White, who pretty much relies on fate and the prince, with a modern Snow White reimagined as more active, but, well, we all know how that movie went. A financial disaster. I think they should probably stick with the old stories. They're a little bit more appealing. In any case, these evolving interpretations do demonstrate that while fairy tales are rooted in the old times, each generation is going to reinterpret them anew. Interestingly, scholarly interpretations also abound. Freudian and Jungian psychologists have probed Grimm's tales for symbols of subconscious struggles, that being the devouring wolf as a parental figure, the forest as the unconscious mind, etc. While socio-historical researchers point out that some tales, like the Robber Bridegroom, which is a frightening tale of cannibalistic murder, may encode real dangers, and the news of the day. That story might reflect anxieties about arranged marriages or actual crime events that turned into a cautionary fairy tale. In any case, in Germany, the legacy of the fairy tale is woven into the very cultural fabric, from Kinder- und Hausmärchen, being found in nearly every household, to tourist attractions, like the German fairy tale route, which links towns associated with the Grimm tales or the storytellers who told them, and that is a good little holiday to go on. Got to keep that in mind, that's for sure. Well, statues of Red Riding Hood, museums for the Brothers Grimm, and annual fairy tale festivals keep the tradition well and truly visible. Yet Germans also approach their fairy tales with an appreciation of their original darkness and complexity. There is not just the sugar-coated versions. There's the older stuff, too. Perhaps if you would explain the plot for the Disney-fied fairy tales to a German, they might laugh and said, oh yes, that is the one where they all get killed at the end, or a flock of crows shows up and pecks everybody's eyes out or something. This kind of thing. Like I said, Disney-fied tales. I'm not a fan of it. I know it's for kids and everything, but it seems they take the old stories, then they change them completely, and then they copyright the names and everything behind it and say no one else is allowed to tell this because our company owns it. But you cannot own such a thing like folklore. I think it's a little bit insulting. Not a big fan of Disney in this channel. Well, indeed. I think today we have to treat everything quite seriously. And we can't look at it just in a modern context. It's a window into folk thought, and also history too, rather than just bedtime fodder. And indeed, the Grimms never saw it just as that. They didn't initially target children as their primary audience. That happened gradually, as parents realized the usefulness of these tales for sort of slipping in moral education, despite the occasional nightmare-inducing scene. It's kind of like hiding vegetables in the meatloaf, giving it to your children, that kind of thing. And that's where we end off for German folklore today. Of course, if you're more interested, I've done full readings of the Brothers Grimm tales. You got videos that go for about 8 hours, 9 hours, that sort of thing. They're all in the compilation videos for sleep playlist, so you can go and enjoy them if you feel inclined. Now, I'm going to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters who have kept all of this ad-free for your enjoyment. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Dalbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gogan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11 Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Gary, Catty B, Lovely, and Poma. All right. That's enough for today. I need a rest. I certainly need a rest. It's only mid-afternoon where I am in the world, but I think it's time for a siesta. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all. And I'll see you next time. Farewell for now.